China has changed the global narrative on delivering early human clinical data with a new bar for speed and efficacy. And now, drug developers and policymakers around the world have gotten the message. This is not a time for complacency. Transformational reform will require rethinking the risk control paradigm for first-in-human trials. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and on this special edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast, we will discuss the bold risks required to overhaul first-in-human trials. It's the subject of BioCentury's 34th back-to-school analysis. Now, back-to-school is a forward-looking analysis that BioCentury's analysts have been doing ever since David Flores and Karen Bernstein launched BioCentury, well, in the early 90s. We try to tackle a forward-looking issue of critical importance to the global biopharma industry. And well, China has thrown down the gauntlet. First in human trials, speed and efficiency. Simone, you and Selena orchestrated this epic 10-story and growing package of analysis that spans what the US, Australia, and China are doing, all the way to Denmark, Spain, definitely a nod to Belgium and the UK, Taiwan, South Korea. Let's begin. Simone, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, it really wasn't difficult to choose the topic for back to school this year because this issue of first in human trials is really critical and global. And we really wanted to take a global view to it and look in all the various regulatory jurisdictions and see what kind of ways people are tackling the question of expediting gaining first in human data, first in patient data in many cases. I want to make a couple of important points. We're going to talk about China a lot. There is a lot of talk about China. This is a big part of the narrative. And to your point, Jeff, about 10 articles, we could call it 30 articles, or we could have called it 5. There's just so much to write about this as new things keep happening. And so we did tend to have a fairly comprehensive package. But I want to make a really important point. This is not actually about China. It is about patients, and it's about a status quo that's yielded really long timelines for drug developments for a long time and a few chances for patients to enter clinical trials. It is critical now because China has raised the bar and created a competitive urgency. Steve is going to get into detail in this in a minute, but in the US, it's been perceived as a very geopolitical matter or play. And European nations, though, are understanding that there's an important role and an opportunity for them to sort of change their status in the biotech order of hubs. And so, all of these countries now have a series of choices, right? Are they going to look at incremental reforms or transformational reforms? Are they going to focus on preventing China from rising? Or are they going to focus on enabling their own innovators' success? Are they going to use industrial policy? Or are they just going to let, the agencies and companies sort it out? And most important, and I think two really big features as I read through, my colleagues' stories, and it really all boils down to two things: risk and control. And just to dig into that a little bit, at every stage of the pathway, people perceive risk, right? So we have safety concerns, which absolutely have to be preserved. But there are different ways that different jurisdictions are approaching that. And there's a lot of sort of Byzantine, as it were, kind of processes, IRBs and review boards and scientific councils. And all of these are largely overlapping and really not necessarily adding value at each stage of the chain or even extra rigor. Quite often it's like, I don't really want to accept the word of that IRB in that other institution or of another regulator. And there are a lot of inefficiencies caused by that. And that's what I mean by control. People want to have control over all the decisions. The result of that really is just a lot of excess timelines within this. Drug development is long enough and hard enough as it is. I'm going to go to Steve in a minute, who's going to talk about the way that things are emerging in the US in terms of trying to change policies and practices that might expedite that path from, preclinical to first in human data. But I think it's, one of the ways of thinking about risk, because each regulator has to rethink risk right now. And a while back, Lawrence Talon, who is the CEO of the UK's agency MHRA, I can't talk to the degree to which he's actually managed to implement this, but he wants a change of philosophy there that puts the patient much more at the center. Quite often, we hear that patients would take risks that regulators don't want them to take. And what he said to us was, as long as the benefit risk is within acceptable parameters and the patient understands it and the clinician understands it, our job is not to hold back that potential, but to make that potential available. And so I think that that is really core, that the regulator's job is to enable patients to access, both through trials and through approved therapies, these innovations. Steve, I'll hand it off to you now. Why don't you start talking about what, you looked at two different aspects within the US. There's the pre-IND, I'm going to use the word innovation, so changes and proposals, and then there's the post-IND ones.
Yeah, well, I actually want to reflect a little bit on what you said, because I want to first and add two things to it. So I think that the overall opportunity here is to quicken the innovation iteration cycle. So it's not just about reducing the time that it takes to develop drugs, but it's about learning from early stage trials, from first in human and especially from first in patient trials, available much more rapidly so that you can have a faster iteration cycle. And the other thing I'd say is that I think that kind of an underappreciated benefit from the whole process globally, if it works out properly, will be that the integration of research into routine care. And what that will do is lay the groundwork for a learning healthcare system. That's a profound change. It's something that people have been talking about for decades. And it needs to be a consensus around some of the risk issues that you talked about and some of the regulatory issues that you talked about to make it happen. But I think that an offshoot or and maybe an unanticipated benefit from making first in human and especially first in patient trials more efficient will be creating this groundwork for a learning healthcare system. So back to my story. As you said, the impetus for the action in the United States has been the perception that China and Chinese companies are eating our lunch. And you only have to look as far as the Operation Trailblazer report. That's a report that HHS put out explaining what it's planning to do to improve first-in-human trial, to make first-in-human trials more efficient. It's a short report, I don't know, 15 pages or something like that. And China's mentioned on almost every page, and no other countries are. So China is the benchmark for what the U.S. is doing, and it's the motivator. Then I think to bookend that, what I've written about is things that HHS, FDA principally, but not entirely, that HHS plans to do under its own authority, and then things that are more transformative that can only be done with legislation. And the bookmark deadline for that is medical user fee reauthorization, PDUFA, and the other fees, which need to be either reauthorized or at least extended by the end of next September in order to prevent them from sunsetting and having disastrous consequences for American medical product regulation. Those are the bookends. There's a great deal of convergence of ideas. These ideas, as I said, have been out there for the last 20, 30 years about how to make first-in-human trials more efficient in the United States. The greatest degree of convergence is on the pre-IND process, the things that are kind of almost mechanical things to do to reduce the time to first-in-human trials. And the convergence is very nicely illustrated by two really thoughtful, in-depth sets of recommendations and analyses that have come out, one produced by the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA and the other by the Duke Margolis Center. They both talk about the steps that need to be done or can be done to improve and make more efficient first-in-human trials in the United States. And they're widely reflected both in Operation Trailblazer which is the steps that HHS is planning to do without needing authority from Congress, and in legislation that Representative Jake Auchincloss is championing that he wants to tie to the PDUFA reauthorization, which will really transform or is intended to transform clinical trial infrastructure in the United States. It focuses on first in human, but it isn't limited to first in human.
Steve, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you regarding the innovation cycle and in particular the learning system. And I think that is one of the things the US, some of these proposals or several of these proposals really have steps that would integrate first in human trials into patient care. The UK is trying to do the same. And I think it will vary by region. I mean, one of the advantages that China has actually is their hospital network system actually makes it much easier to enroll patients. Because I wanted to make the point that China's advantage, people often talk about China's advantage being one of just a larger population, meaning more patients, faster patient recruitment. That is true, but it's not the only part of it. What I thought was interesting was you had these various proposals that you talked about effectively for, you and Selena worked on a very nice table comparing them. And I think there were 33 reforms across the proposals. And when you look at them, there's 73% convergence, right? So 3 out of 4 of the models of the proposals agree on more than 75%, let's say, of the reforms. What that means to me is a lot of this is, I don't want to say it's obvious, but it's low-hanging fruit. These are not controversial things. Many people agree on these things. I do feel like implementing them isn't necessarily that straightforward, but the ideas of what to do to improve these sort of timelines, there's really a lot of ground there that is not controversial.
Yeah, so there are these 4 streams. I don't really view them as being the same things, though. So basically, you've got Reagan-Udall's report and the Duke-Margolis report, which are reflecting broad thinking among key opinion leaders. And then you've got HHS in Operation Trailblazer report talking about what it plans to do in the pre-IND process. And there's a great deal of, as I said, a great deal of convergence there. And then you've got Representative Auchincloss's discussion draft, which is being revised, and I think we'll see a new version of it very soon, that talks both about the pre-IND part, but also about the post-IND part. And that's where there's the most divergence. I think one of the things that Representative Auchincloss has said is, and it's reflected in his discussion draft, is he wants the United States to adopt a clinical trial notification pathway that's similar to what they have in Australia. I think we'll be talking about that later on this podcast. That would be a major change in the way that things are thought about in the United States. And then there are also different ideas about how to go about integrating clinical research into routine care. Some of those ideas are about setting up phase 1 units that can do phase 1 trials outside of the major academic medical centers to make phase 1 trials, first in human trials, available to more of the United States, because right now, most of those trials in the United States are happening at academic medical centers. There's only a very small portion of the population that lives within a convenient distance of an academic medical center. And then there are other ideas about integrating clinical research, the ability to ask questions that are relevant for clinical research into electronic health records, what needs to be done in order to do that. And then finally, a third thing, which is interesting, which is what FDA is moving forward on. It's a proposal, but I think that it's pretty clear they're going to move forward with it in one form or another, are the QRIs, the qualified research institutions that are going to partner with biopharma companies. You can have academic medical centers, consultants, and CROs that are going to help sponsors. And I think this is going to be particularly important for small biotechs, develop their pre-IND packages so that they go into FDA with something that can be authorized, that can be allowed to proceed without having to have a lot of iteration back and forth and the kind of amendments, which are one of the main things right now that slow down the process.
Yeah, and that help for smaller biotech is what is so essential in this first in human process. Now, whenever I'm speaking with a CEO or someone in the C-suite about what they're doing with their early clinical trials, I'm like, so where are you going to run those trials? Are you running them in the US? Are you going to run them in your home country? And more often than not, I feel like the answer is Australia. And I'm like, why? And they're like, well, that's just what we do these days. And so I'd like to bring in Lauren here. Lauren spent some time going down under, and we all know that Australia has sort of been this magnet for first in human trials. So, Lauren, I'm curious, what is their secret sauce, and what are they going to be doing to defend their turf, defend the mantle?
Thanks, Jeff. So, what Australia does right is first in human healthy volunteer trials, specifically, I think, for small biotech. So, this is about, which Steve just mentioned, helping small biotechs. Australia, over many years, has developed dedicated phase 1 units that are set up specifically for this purpose. They're contracted for this purpose. They have relationships with the CROs and the hospital systems, and just they have a huge system in place to pump through healthy volunteers and get these healthy volunteer trials out quickly. That's combined with, and this is the part that helps the small biotechs, a major tax incentive specifically for companies that, fall below a threshold of annual revenue, where as long as a company has a presence in Australia, which may be a quick to stand up subsidiary, for example, they can get a tax refund of up to 43.5% on R&D expenditures. So that's sort of one of the things that draws these companies from across the globe to Australia to run these trials. And I think the other bit that Steve and Simone also mentioned is the notification system. So for these, very standard healthy volunteer studies, it's a quick yes or no, and it's a very quick trial startup. So Selena will talk about the timelines later, I think, but this is really unmatched with how fast you can get healthy volunteer phase 1 data.
So the other thing about Australia, though, is that they're reaching capacity, right? It's not like they can run all of the first in human trials for the whole world or even for the United States. If there's going to be this kind of efficiency for the whole biopharma innovation ecosystem, there are going to have to be changes. They're going to be similar, or at least going to allow similar kinds of timelines to Australia outside of Australia, right?
Of course. And we have heard throughout some of our interviews for this back to school issue that Australia is reaching its capacity. This is also part of the reason why Australia is so good for healthy volunteer trials, is because the country is small. It simply doesn't have a lot of patients for first in human patient studies, although some of that is happening. But I did speak with some stakeholders in Australia about the fact that other countries, other regulators have taken notice of this system that they have, of how quickly they can move through healthy volunteer and phase 1 studies. And those are the reforms that we're seeing roll out. So the question for Australia was, how do you sort of stay relevant when other countries are bringing down their timelines and bringing down their costs? There were a few different responses. Some of the CROs have mentioned adjusting the phase 1 trial design so that companies who come to Australia to run their first in human trials are getting more out of those studies. The idea of blending a first in human healthy volunteer study with a phase 2 type trial where you're getting a little bit of information about how the drug is working in actual patients, more of the PK and PD information. That was one of the sort of trends that we're seeing in how Australia is conducting these trials. Another came from Roseanne Hyland at Aus Biotech, who mentioned that there are some initiatives that are underway that could, build on the speed and everything that we're seeing happen in Australia. So specifically, there is this proposal for a national one-stop shop, which would sort of better standardize various things across the different research institutions in Australia to make the multi-site Australian trials even faster and more seamless. It would be like one place online for companies to register trials, identify trial sites, identify ethics boards that will be involved in the trial, and for patients and physicians to also see a lot of that trial information. So those are just a couple examples of how Australia was thinking about staying relevant as the rest of the world sort of catches up to what's been happening there.
Yeah, I mean, just, two things stand out in that for me. One, let's talk about the notification system, because this is something that Australia's had for a while. and that other jurisdictions, the UK, the US, and maybe some others, are starting to think about that, which effectively in Australia, that shifts the responsibility to ethics committees rather than the regulator to authorize the first in human study. There are various permutations on what that can look like, but that for me is an example of changing your risk profile to be a little bit more risk tolerant. So it doesn't have to be that everything goes through the regulator, which slows things down. Nobody thinks that Australia is more lax on its ethics or regulatory standards. Most people will not consider that. They may have some Crocodile Dundee things to say about Australia, but certainly not on the regulatory front. And I think the other thing that I was interested in with Australia, which I think is going to come up when we talk about China, is that Australia's been ahead of the game, and they're not just like, yep, we've got this position. They are still modernizing and adapting to the new world all the time, because they realize if they want to maintain this status, like you've just pointed out, Lauren, they actually have to keep upping their game as well. And so for me, I think this is an interesting intersection of sort of competition and at the same time, definitely a policy and regulatory changes that can really benefit patients.
And I think that it's also important to make the distinction between first in human and first in patient, and especially when you're thinking about notification systems. So if you're looking, there's a good quote that's in one of my stories from David Hong, the deputy chair of the Department of Investigational Cancer Therapies at MD Anderson. He says, in oncology, the first in human study is the first real turning point in a drug's life. It's the point at which a new mechanism is first tested in patients and the point that unlocks the investment needed to carry development forward. So I think that, the regulatory considerations for first in patient, which is what a lot of most cancer phase 1 trials are different from the kind of notification things that are required for first in human in healthy volunteers. And also the follow-on impacts of being the first place to have oncology first in patient studies are quite different, both for the patients who benefit from them and for investors, and where the future development of drugs is going to happen.
So when you talk about Australia retaining its destination, its position as a destination for early trials, by kind of creating a seamless experience between that healthy volunteer study and getting your first patients, you also said in that same section that it doesn't have a lot of patients, right? It just has a small population. But I think what we've seen in China through the IIT system is that even 2-3 patients, there's just a couple of patients, the data you get from them can be really useful for decision-making purposes and de-risking. So maybe that is the thing that can work in Australia. But let's talk a little bit about these two different tracks in China and what they offer and how they're evolving, like the standard IND pathway and the IIT.
Selena, that's a good point. And before we move on to China, I just wanted to mention the value that we've heard that some biotechs are seeing in the small cohorts of patient data that you can get within a phase 1 or phase 1/2 trial in Australia, is that because the Australian trials can start so quickly, a company could apply in parallel to start a phase 1 site in Australia and in the US, maybe collect some data from healthy volunteers and even a few patients that would be available to support the IND before it's actually been approved in the US. And that in some cases may allow to start at a higher dose or, some tweak to the trial design that would be happening in the US IND. So that was an interesting part of that strategy that we heard about. And of course, when I say approved in the United States, I mean that the IND is allowed to proceed. And then moving on to China, as you mentioned, a lot of this is about China's speed and about the benefits and the value proposition of running first in human trials in China. And the main difference between China and Australia, as you referenced, is the fact that there are a lot of patients there. And the patients, just based on how the healthcare system works, are often really concentrated in certain major medical centers. So that's a huge benefit for companies when it comes to recruitment timelines. But I think the important distinction here is that there are sort of two first-in-human paths within China. So you've got the more traditional IND path, where the timelines of the actual regulatory steps don't look that much different than what an IND timeline would look like in the US. A lot of that speed does come from the patient recruitment and some other things that happen after the actual application, and maybe before the application too. And I think you can probably get into that. The alternative pathway that gets a lot of the attention, I think is why a lot of people think things are so fast in China and so cheap in China, is the investigator-initiated trial pathway, or the IIT. The idea here is that you can bypass, or traditionally you could bypass a lot of the traditional regulatory requirements, get approval to run a trial of a cell or gene therapy specifically in a very small amount of patients by an academic investigator with just a local IRB approval. So these things can move very quickly. They can be run with little money, and you can get some really early proof of signal data from just a few patients without a ton of regulatory oversight, and just, again, on a fast and inexpensive timeline.
Right. I think, I want to just introduce one thing while we're talking about China, even though I've said this isn't about China. Obviously, it's a very big part of the conversation. A lot of times I still hear people saying, yeah, but their ethics really aren't there. I think we're going to do a little bit of a focus on the new IND guardrails and regulations that are coming in. And I sort of want to make the point that I'm not here really to talk about everybody in China's ethics. I think that there's certainly a lot more willingness to turn a blind eye to how patient consent happens in the US versus in China, a lot of pressure there. But I think that that's not really the point. The point is that quality data are coming out of China. Investors are making investment decisions on it, and it's part of the landscape now. I think the data show that there's this fear, right, that everybody from the United States is flocking to China to do their studies there. Anecdotally, it might sound like that, but just talk a little bit about when you looked at the data, that's not really a correct representation of what's going on, really.
It's not a correct representation of what's been going on. There certainly is a trend that more first-in-human trials by US biotechs have sites in China, and that this has been increasing over the past 4 years that we have data to represent, but it has not been a rapid increase. So just to give a quick overview of the numbers, in 2021, our data show, and data, I believe this is from clinicaltrials.gov, which may not encompass all trials, but should pretty well capture what the US biotechs are doing. About 3% had sites in China, and in 2025, that doubled to about 6%. So it's certainly not the case that every company is going to China to run its first-in-human trials. But I think it is something to be aware of, that this is something that's on the rise.
And I think that the more important thing to think about is the advantage that a rapid first-in-human trial system in China gives to Chinese companies. So it allows them to have this very fast iteration cycle that we've talked about. And it's one of the things I think that's fueling all of the licensing and deal-making between US and European biopharmas and Chinese companies. If they didn't have the ability to have this really rapid generation of data, they wouldn't have as much of an advantage, as much of an ability to develop drugs rapidly as they have.
But here's another place where we can maybe do a little bit of myth busting. Like, not only are US companies not really flocking to China for their early studies, if you look at the standard IND pathway in China for getting a study started, the time from submitting that application to first patient, there is some data out there on that across regions, right? And that pathway is not all that much faster. So what it takes to get ready to submit, and then the enrollment part, afterwards, those might be wildly different.
And that
startup pathway is not all that different. And the IIT piece of it, those regulations recently changed, right? And are becoming more stringent. So that window or door to faster data might also be closing to some extent. I think the jury's out on that a little bit, but yes, go ahead, Steve.
So, and I think that gets to the part where I think is the most important in the United States, which is increasing the accrual, the speed and the volume of accrual in the United States. And that's where China has a big advantage. And it's not just because China has a really big population. I think that's a little bit of a silly way to look at it. It's because they have really big medical centers where they can get large numbers of patients for a trial. They can get them enrolled really, really rapidly. So
I
it's
think
not
also
about
they right, and that's what. So first of all, they're concentrated sort of on the East Coast, and patients actually will travel to that area to be in the catchment. But I think also that you don't have to go first of all to your primary care practitioner and then to somebody. You can go directly to the specialist who might enroll you directly in a trial. And that's one of the ways we talked at the top of the podcast about integrating trials into healthcare. And that's, to your point, Steve, that's one of the ways where they're not just the population advantage, where they are so much more efficient. And the UK, I think Stephen's going to talk in a couple of minutes, or maybe now, about the Europe, which, by the way, for some of us includes the UK still, at least emotionally. But, that's an area that they're trying to use the NHS as a way to embed trials into routine care. And I think that that's a theme that we're going to see globally probably rise.
And really quickly, before we go, Stephen, I think another thing that's happening in the United States, another set of proposals that are really important in the United States, is changing the incentives and removing some of the disincentives and the friction for patients to enroll in clinical trials in the United States, and also creating opportunities for the big medical centers, for example, like the Texas Medical Center and Duke and some of the others, for the big medical centers to be able to, in some ways, emulate what's happening in China.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and throw it over to Stephen, who will let us know what's happening in Europe and the UK.
This episode of the BioCentury Show is brought to you by the 13th China Healthcare Summit, taking place November 2nd to 4th in Shanghai. Everyone has an opinion about China biotech, but there's a difference between reading about cross-border deals and seeing it for yourself. The 13th China Healthcare Summit brings you to Shanghai November 2nd to 4th for a first-hand look at China's innovation moment. Join BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company for a deep dive into China's biopharma ecosystem, and meet the biotech leaders who are driving all the news flow. Sourcing innovation, building new cos, generating faster clinical data, reimagining your R&D strategy. For a dozen years, the China Healthcare Summit has gathered the right people to network and build business. Now it's your chance to be in the room. Join us in Shanghai this November. Opt into the tour of Suzhou and a visit to Shanghai Clinical Trial Centers. See it for yourself. Register at biocenturychinasummit.com.
All right, we are back on a special edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast. We're talking our annual back to school issue focused on first in human trials. I want to bring in podcast co-host and Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence, Stephen Hansen, our man on the ground in the UK. Stephen, what did you learn?
Well, I just learned that I got a promotion. Thank you, Jeff. That was great.
Stephen,
I'll take it.
I always have your back. I always have your back.
Sure, that surprised Simone just as much as you, excluding the UK from Europe.
She fights a good fight in the management meetings, Stephen.
So what I was sort of asked to do was look at both sort of Europe, where they focused on the broader EU-led sort of multinational trials, and then kind of look at some of the spotlights of individual countries. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the EU stuff because I think everyone's pretty aware of kind of the fragmentation that you have across the EU and kind of how that might impact the regulatory decision-making there and some of the review of clinical trial applications. So if you want to read the details of that, feel free to check out our story. There's a lot of detail there about what some of the proposals are and how they think that might sort of help to speed things up. But what I did want to kind of focus in on was some of the bright spots, that we found. First off, Simone's already mentioned a couple of the reforms that are happening in the UK, which I do still think of as part of Europe. They've had some major reforms going on. They're targeting, sort of a fast track service. Also looking at healthy volunteers to do assessments within 14 days. Again, like Lauren was talking about earlier, they're looking at a notification scheme for low-risk trials that could proceed without a formal review by MHRA. So, there's some really positive things going on there, along with that sort of longer-term ambition of really embedding these sorts of trials into the NHS system. But, one other country I really wanted to call out and focus on, which I found quite interesting, was what Denmark is doing. I think there's a lot of parallels, actually, in the sense of what they're trying to achieve and what their possibilities are with what Lauren was talking about with Australia, in the sense that, it's a small country, small population, but it has a couple things that I think, give it a lot of opportunity, in that it has a very well joined together academic and national healthcare system. And it also has a centralized ethics review board for looking at these sorts of trials. So last year, Denmark launched what they term an expedited process for all phase 1 and phase 1/2 trials. And they're targeting as little as 14 days from validation to approval. So that gives it a really competitive prospect when it comes to speed globally. As I mentioned, how they're achieving this is partly by sort of having this centralized ethics committee process, so they can actually run the review in parallel in a very centralized fashion. But then the other issue that they really focused on was, like a lot of other aspects across Europe, there's not a ton of funding available for this sort of thing. And so how Denmark was able to get around that was essentially they focused on prioritization. If you choose to go on this expedited path in Denmark, then essentially you'll be kicked to the front of the queue, as they would say here in the UK. So the focus is really on getting these studies reviewed and approved and up and running as fast as they possibly can, and working with the ethics boards to get things moving as quickly as they can. And, they have seen a real uptake in the number of companies and sponsors that are wanting to come do this. And, to sort of try and pair back to what Lauren was talking about in terms of just a few patients, that is one of the issues, one of the things that I think, is possibly achievable in a country like Denmark, is that despite the fact that it's that this is only for single nation trials, if you're a small biotech that is only looking to get a handful of patients, a setup like this in a single country could very well be a good opportunity to be able to achieve that. So I just find that sort of an interesting parallel between, what we were discussing about with Australia, as well as what we're seeing sort of coming through in Denmark.
Any other regions you have your eye on, Stephen?
Yeah, well, the other one that we obviously then focused on the UK, and the other one that popped up a lot in the conversations was Spain. This was sort of deemed to be kind of a real bright spot for clinical trials. A lot of it that I found really interesting was just sort of what an outsized sort of role and participation they had in reviewing clinical trials, both sort of mononational and multinational clinical trials in Europe. So I think they reviewed the most applications than any other member state since 2022. They had the second most mononationals. Basically, despite their size, they really are seen as one of the leading regulators when it comes to trying to expedite the review of these clinical trials. They're leading they're one of the leading regulators for the FAST EU initiative, which is basically a test case for this Europe-wide, more aggressive timeline for reviews. They have their own national expedited review service that's also been stood up and going. So, I think that's a really interesting place. And then maybe a honorable mention. Belgium came up a couple of times as well as being another country that is trying to be at the forefront here of speeding up the process.
And to be clear, those are best case scenarios. So that 14-day number, countries love to advertise that, the UK and Denmark.
It is true.
But there is about, validation is also a thing. So first it has to be submitted, it has to be validated. That can take up to a week. And then 14 days is best case if there are no requests for information.
That's
right?
Yep.
And so of the 3 case studies you looked at there, I think Spain was the only one where somebody gave you data. It's been going on long enough now they can give you an actual median on how long it's taking. So most don't get through with no request.
I think
so it's more like a 66
the reality
day
is there's always some questions. But I think even
it's still
without,
speedy. I just wanted to
it's still relative to how things used to be in Europe. It's still a lot faster. So I think that's one of the primary take homes there.
All right, thanks for that, Stephen. Stephen's stories, as all of these, you can find at biocenturyback2school.com. If you are a subscriber, that will take you to all of the stories, as well as the past couple of years of Back to School. If you're not a subscriber, there's a link. You'll be able to learn more about what a BioCentury subscription is all about. Obviously, much more content. We looked at the COVID experience and what that says about how quickly you can stand up a trial. We took a look at what's happening in Asia outside of China and how companies like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore are trying to get into the early stage clinical trial game to attract outside sponsors.
Jeff, something that really struck me from your story on these other Asian hubs outside of China is that they seem to be playing, in some ways, a different game. Like, they're not trying to necessarily be the next Australia, but they want to make it easier so that when companies are doing multi-regional trials, to be included in those trials, right? And so one way that you wrote about Japan doing that is the Japanese regulator kind of accepting data, trial designs that have been approved elsewhere, right? So that takes us back to maybe where we started at the beginning of this, our theme of control, trust, risk. So in order to make things move faster and have the whole system function better, where peers who are qualified make a decision, others honoring that decision can speed up the whole process. So I don't know if Simone wants to bring us home.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Selena. That is actually spot on. The way I think about this is there's so much momentum that I think we're sort of past a critical point. So I think there will be change, right? I think there will be some changes in almost every region that we've discussed. They might be at different phases, but one of the obvious things, and I think we're moving in that direction, is this recognition of peers, of some kind of reciprocity, let's say, at an IRB level, sometimes at an agency level. In the articles, we document what this might look like. And I think that is likely to start happening. I think the second part of it that Steve and I touched on, I hope it'll happen, but it will for sure take longer, which is the idea of embedding clinical trials in patient care. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built out. That takes time. It may not be controversial to us or even to people in the ecosystem, but obviously any expenditure of money, certainly by governments, doesn't happen overnight, and building infrastructure takes longer. But I do think that it is really an important part of this landscape. And so, it's obviously, this is going to be the gift that keeps on giving for us. We will continue to write about it and follow it. And, I think it is a scene that is changing and probably going to accelerate in the pace of change.
All right, and there you have it. Lauren, Selena, Steve, Stephen, and Simone. Thank you for joining me to talk about the back to school package. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We'll be back with our regular podcast Monday. Thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra for creating the music for BioCentury's podcast. Catch you next week.